Hello, my name's Emily, and today I'll be presenting my literary work presentation from 1945 to present. In this presentation, I'll be exploring Maxine Hong Kingston's No Name Woman and the themes it explores through its unique characters. So, starting off with the author herself, Kingston was born October 27th, 1940, in Stockton, California. Kingston has dedicated much of her writing to her experience as a first generation Chinese American. Many of her literary works have reached the masses within her lifetime, earning her awards such as the National Medal of Arts and the National Book Award. One of Kingston's most notable works is The Woman Warrior, Memoirs of a Girlhood Among Ghosts. Within this greater work is where we'll find No Name Woman, which is a riveting story on what it means to grow up as a woman in China and how that changes with immigration and culture changes. So, in order to understand the No Name Woman story, we first must come to understand the context of what it was like to grow up in China in the 1920s, which is presumably when this story took place. The 1920s were a difficult time for many Chinese women due to the existing hierarchies that were implemented by the Chinese government. Kingston talks about these hierarchies throughout the work of No Name Woman, but I would like to refer to the article Reform of Women's Roles in Family Structures in the Recent History of China, written by Joyce Jennings Wallstelt. As she states, women, with the exception of mothers in law, wives of eldest sons, favorite concubines, or wives of the official elite, were at the bottom of a very elaborate pecking order. This quote stood out for many reasons, but most notably for the fact that it showcases the ties that women's suffrage had to poverty and sort of the life that you were born into, which obviously is not something that people have a choice in. And it's where we find the no name woman within this poverty, within this culture of elitism that sort of ends up with a story like Kingston's aunt and many others alike. With this acknowledgement of Chinese culture and how it affected women in the past, it's also important to acknowledge American culture and its relation to the women's suffrage movement. And there is a pretty big difference when you compare it to Chinese uh, culture and the way in which women progressed throughout time. In the U.S., we saw the women's suffrage movement as early as the 1800s, and by 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed in America, which allowed women the right to vote. America still faced and still faces many issues concerning gender. However, it was substantially more progressive compared to China's view on women. With both China and the US's history in mind, now we can understand how the story of No Name Woman utilizes its unique characters in order to deliver the themes of misogyny, cultural taboos, and breaking generational curses. So, to start off, I would like to relate the No Name Woman as a character to misogyny and how that affected her life and the ultimate tragic ending to the story. Through this character, we can understand the extremes in which can take place due to a misogynistic culture and how that can affect not just a person in one generation, but move forward into other generations, as we see later on in the story. To circle back to the idea of poverty and how it relates to the way in when women were viewed in China, there's the quote from Kingston within the No Name Woman story where she states, quote, "To be a woman, to have a daughter in starvation time was a waste enough. My aunt could not have been the lone romantic who gave up everything for sex. Women in the old China did not choose." This quote is one of the most informative I feel from the whole story, as it showcases the way in which women really did not have a choice at that time. Even more so, it hints at the fact that Kingston's aunt didn't have a choice to have intercourse and to be impregnated, which adds another layer of female mistreatment and a feeling of injustice that I think Kingston and the reader carry alongside them throughout the reading. What makes this all the more heartbreaking is the way in which the no name woman's story is not taken as something to sympathize with or learn from, but instead is used as a weapon to perpetrate that same idea that women should not have a choice and should be careful with what they do with their own bodies, when in reality, the system that surrounds them is what controls them a lot of the time. This moves into my next point about Kingston's mother and how she perpetuates the cultural taboos present in her own childhood and the generation before her own. One of the most clear and impactful ways in which Kingston's mother sort of uses this story as a control weapon is when she tells her, quote, "Now that you have started to menstruate, what happened to her could not happen to you. Don't humiliate us. You wouldn't like to be forgotten as if you had never been born," end quote. This in turn instills fear into Kingston as a young child and imprints into her an idea of what a woman should be and shouldn't be. One could argue that Kingston's mother had no ill intent with this control tactic, but just wanted to protect Kingston from the cultural taboos that she knows exist in her own culture and sort of give off what she knows and the knowledge that she holds precious to herself, not realizing that it could hurt her daughter in the future and end with a story like the No Name Woman. With this in mind, we have to realize who is in charge of breaking the cycle. And in this case, we see Kingston being in charge of breaking that cycle, which we'll discuss soon. In addition to this, I want to mention the little image here of the dragon eating its own tail. I believe this image is very impactful because it goes to show the destructive nature of cycles and sort of how it consumes people and cultures and societies from within, but also how difficult it is to sort of break these cycles and create something new, something powerful for the future. Lastly, we have Kingston and her choice to break generational curses, and how it comes to be through her immigration and cultural perspectives. As mentioned, this is not an easy feat, but it's something that Kingston takes on throughout the story of No Name Woman. An important quote that I saw was, quote, "Those of us in the first American generations have had to figure out how the invisible world the immigrants built around our childhood fits in solid America," end quote. At first read, this quote may sound confusing, but after some analysis, I realized that what Kingston is referring to as the invisible world is the imaginary world, the world that Kingston has been brought up with through stories and cautionary tales like the ones her mother has told her, and how that relates and compares to the world that she exists in physically, which is America. This American culture and cultural influence, I believe, is what drives Kingston to want to do her job at breaking down generational traumas. The article written by Jeffrey Prager brings up the term social redress, which he explains as, quote, "how contemporary societies address their own traumatic past and attempt to overcome fundamental rifts between victims and perpetrators," end quote. I believe this quote explains perfectly as to what Kingston is trying to do with the No Name Woman story. As we see early in the story, the first line being that Kingston's mom wishes her not to tell this story to anybody, to keep it a secret, to keep it solely as a cautionary tale between families. And we see immediately Kingston break this promise and sort of go ahead and write this whole entire story, which would put shame to her family, and through her mother's perspective. And we see her trying to invoke social redress and sort of bring light to the story of her aunt and how it still affects her generation and how it conflicts with the culture she grew up with in America. So, to conclude and summarize this complex narrative of the No Name Woman, we first talked about the No Name Woman and what she represents in terms of misogyny and the culture of China in the 1920s, and how it still is perpetuated through people like Kingston's mother who use it as cautionary tales, not realizing that it's perpetuating harmful cycles. And then lastly, how one chooses to break generational cycles and why, which can be for many reasons, but most notably and most specifically to Kingston's life, through immigration and cultural changes. So, in the end, self identity is formed through what we are told as children. At times, this information can create harmful narratives that interrupt the way in which we approach the world. Being raised in a different culture can disrupt these generational narratives and leave room for healing and retribution. Again, this was my literary work presentation for 1945 to present times on Maxine Hong Kingston's No Name Woman. This story was very interesting to analyze and dive deep into the characters and what they represent, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.